The 2020 Democratic primary features nearly 24 candidates, including several women and people of color. But a CNN poll out this week shows former Vice President Joe Biden getting nearly 40% of the vote and Senator Bernie Sanders coming in second with 15%. Both candidates are nearing 80 years old and have sharp policy contrasts. A new article out this morning on CBSNews.com explores the coming fight between the two candidates as they try to win over voters that went for President Trump in 2016. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns wrote that story, and she is here with me this morning. So this is very interesting, Caitlin. Like we just said, the president won over certain areas like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. I'm thinking about the suburbs of Philadelphia, which were sort of swing areas, and the president was able to win over some of these areas, and that's partially how he won the election. And now we're seeing Bernie Sanders and Biden target those areas as well.
It really is interesting, too, because when you think of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, they don't really have a lot in common when it comes to their philosophy, their ideology, and their policy proposals. But they do have a lot in common because they both feel like they can appeal to Trump voters. They're the same age. They served in Congress for a long time. And they both feel like they are the ones uniquely positioned to take on Donald Trump directly, campaigning in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio even, and really messaging to voters that they feel their economic anxieties. And that's what you're hearing from both candidates. But it's going to be so interesting to see how much they kind of overlap in terms of their constituency. There are polls that show that they're each other's second choice for voters that support them at this point in time, and how they kind of go after each other, if at all.
Yeah, well, that was going to be sort of my next question. I mean, how do they play this? I'm sure they don't want to sort of rip each other apart. I mean, that's part of the challenge when you have a field like this of Democratic challengers, that they'll just sort of tear each other apart before the whole thing, before they pick a winner, and that winner will be so battle scarred by the end. So how do you see this dynamic between these two men playing out?
It's such a good question, and the reason I was kind of interested in doing this story was because earlier this week, Bernie Sanders was doing a television interview, and he drew explicit contrasts with Joe Biden. He said, Joe Biden voted for NAFTA, I voted against it. He supported the Iraq War, I voted against it. Named a bunch of trade policies and other items that Joe Biden supported and Bernie Sanders voted against. So it was really seen as kind of the first shot across the bow that Bernie Sanders was taking. And I've talked to Bernie aides who say that he's not going to go after Biden personally, but he is going to want to draw those contrasts. And I was trying to figure out kind of what their relationship was. They both overlapped in the Senate only for 2 years, but they have both been in public service for so long. They don't really have much of a relationship, but they both really respect each other and they get along. And it was interesting, I found a clip of Biden campaigning in Vermont several years ago, and he called Bernie the conscience of the Senate, and he really heaped all this praise upon Bernie. So we might see that dug up again by the campaign coming up.
You mentioned how philosophically they're quite different, and Bernie Sanders sort of identifies as a socialist, if you will, and Biden is more of a centrist. But I'm wondering how you think that will play within this party, where it certainly seems like the rising stars within the party are the more left-leaning new additions to the party. Will that help Bernie Sanders, do you think?
It's really interesting because Bernie Sanders is kind of, a lot of his policies that were once considered fringe proposals are now kind of mainstream in the party. And that presents some real challenges for Joe Biden and kind of shows how much the party has changed since the last time Joe Biden ran for anything. And I've talked to aides on both sides who say that they can see pros and cons for both of them. So for Bernie Sanders, having Biden in the race is helpful to him to kind of draw those contrasts. On the other hand, for Biden, having Bernie in the race lets him kind of separate himself from what the current president, is kind of painting with a broad brush as socialists. So he's able to say, look, I'm not one of those people. So it's going to be really interesting to watch kind of how they're foils for one another and how they use one another to advance their own kind of policy proposals or visions for the country.
One of the things we keep mentioning about this large field of Democratic candidates that keeps growing, it seems like weekly, is how diverse it is. And then you can't help but to sort of see that the two people leading in the polls right now are older white men.
Exactly. And this is the most crowded and diverse field that this party has ever seen in modern presidential campaigns, and it really presents a challenge. I was in Houston last week covering a conference that was geared towards women of color, and a lot of presidential candidates spoke. Bernie Sanders was also there, and he was not well received by this crowd at all. You know who was? Elizabeth Warren. So this is the kind of the dynamic that both of them are facing in this party, where women especially are going to be a driving force in terms of voters, but also in terms of candidates. And there is this question about, where does the party want to go? Do they want someone like Biden, who is a little more centrist and diplomatic and kind of the old school thought? Do they want someone like Bernie, who's, you know, very much with them on the policy? Or do they want someone who represents the kind of change they want to see? We'll have to see. But it's interesting that they're on top of the field at this point.
It really is. It's fascinating. Check out Caitlin's article on CBSNews.com. Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you very much.